Welcome back to Acadiana's Morning News. So we have been talking about the issues. We've been dealing with the candidates that you'll see on the ballot November 8th, or if you have early voted. But the one thing we continue to get questions about are the constitutional amendments. Okay, there are 6 that you'll be voting on. So we decided to bring in the big guns this morning. Stephen Procopio from Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana in the studio. Good morning.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So we do have the 6th sitting in front of us, okay? And you focus on this, obviously leading up to this election. You didn't just get these last week. You guys have done a lot of research on these, what they meant, and we'll start to go through them.
Right. Every year we do a guide to the constitutional amendments, and so we have this year's guide. We do the pros and the cons. We don't take a position, but we try to explain what's actually in these things.
All right, well, let's jump in. Number 1, establish new requirements for Registrar of Voters. What does this one mean?
So the registrar is actually in the Constitution, but it's hired at the local level. So they needed a constitutional amendment to add additional requirements in terms of what type of degree you need, how much experience, as well as also how you go about hiring them, make sure it's advertised, so that there is a more stringent process in terms of who gets selected and how.
All right, let's move on to number 2, allowing college management boards to set tuition and fees without legislative approval. This one obviously a big deal here in our town with UL right down the street.
Yeah, absolutely, and with the community colleges and actually across the state. This is a pretty easy one to understand, but it's a complicated one in terms of what the effects are. On one hand, you're going to let the colleges increase their own tuition or reduce their own tuition as they feel they need to, instead of having the state legislature get a 2/3 vote to get it done.
Let me ask you, before we get to number 3, how do these come about? I mean, are they proposed on the lawmaker end, from the legislature? How do they get on the ballot?
Sure, it's any legislator can bring it. It requires a 2/3 vote in both chambers, and it is not able to be vetoed by the governor.
Okay.
So it's a tough process, but we still see a lot of them.
I was about to say, and that's probably why we have 6. There were probably 30
Right.
maybe have been proposed, but has to kind of go through that.
Exactly.
Okay, let's move on to number 3. No deduction of federal income tax for business and sets a flat rate.
Okay, so the first thing to understand about this one is that it only affects those that file corporate income tax. So it won't affect any individuals that are filing individual income tax. And in fact, most businesses won't be affected because a lot of businesses file individual income tax as well. It's just those few that file corporate income tax. And on that, in the Constitution, it says there is a deduction for your taxes paid on the federal income tax. So you can take that as a deduction. Mm-hmm. This constitutional amendment gets rid of that big deduction. It's a pretty big one. But on the other hand, it then creates a lower flat rate. So it's roughly revenue neutral. So it's a way of decoupling the state tax system from the federal tax system.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, moving on. Number 4, allows surviving spouses of people killed in the line of duty full property tax exemption.
Right. So we all have a homestead exemption right now. This would give 100% exemption on the the residency that you live in, if you're the surviving spouse of someone that was in the military and died on active duty, or was a police officer or firefighter and died while in the line of duty. So it would be a 100% exemption, but if someone gets remarried, then that exemption would go away.
Okay, makes sense. Number 5, create a revenue stabilization trust fund. What is this one about?
So for context, and I think this is something people in Lafayette are going to understand, that mineral revenues, which we get a lot of in the state, are very volatile. You can have an up market, you can have a low market, and that affects the economy, and it affects how much revenue the state gets. This is an attempt to try and divert some of the highs into a trust fund. So when mineral revenues is really high, some of that money doesn't get spent in the operating budget, but gets siphoned away into a side fund. And then that side fund can be built up as an asset that can later be spent on infrastructure and roads.
Okay. So this final one, Congressional Amendment number 6, obviously came into play this year with 2 budget sessions. Changes protected funds used for deficits.
Hey, this is a tough one.
Yeah,
this is a complicated one. What the author is trying to do with this one is make it easier to go in and sweep some funds so that you can protect things. There's a lot of constitutionally locked up funds, about 50. This would allow, it would make it a little easier to try and go in and use those funds in an ensuing budget year. It's actually used when there's a shortfall in the current year. They go in and they sweep 5% of these funds and they use it. But for the ensuing year, it's rarely used, this trigger. So he has set up a mechanism to try and make that easier to use some of these fund sweeps for the following year.
Okay, because we hear a lot about healthcare and higher ed. Obviously, when we start to talk about these now, those are two huge, big budgets that,
Right.
when you look at the state as a whole, this would basically just, if I'm understanding right, allow for more of the other funding streams.
It can only be used when the projection for next year decreases. So you thought you were going to have a certain amount of money in the forecast, and the forecast later is decreased by at least 1%. Then you're going to get this trigger would be hit, and then you can go in and sweep 5% of these funds.
A lot to look into. We have all this information on our website, kpel965.com, as we go through the amendments. Stephen Procopio from the Public Affairs Research Council of Louisiana. We appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you very much.
Get out and vote. All the information is there, and you can read more about these amendments at govote.com, GEAUVOTE.com. There's more Acadiana's Morning News coming up after this.